Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Two Jakes from 1990. Now, this one I actually mentioned some videos ago when we were talking about Chinatown, because this is a sequel to Chinatown, and even more of a sequel than I thought. We'll go back to that in a second. This is partially because I wanted to mix things up a little bit, but also because it's continuing this sort of arc of me exploring noir and mystery and westerns, and how I've watched a couple of westerns now and noted how they run parallel to a lot of noir aspects. Now, this is made in 1990. It's prequel implies a certain level of lesserness than, I don't know, it's got connotations that aren't quite right. Anyway, Chinatown's a very well-known film. I did my video on that, liked it a lot. And it's weird because Chinatown's from 1974. This is from 1990. It's a whole, decade and a half plus later. Apparently it was supposed to be made much earlier, but fell through on a bunch of things. And it's in a weird kind of spot, because even in 1974, the idea of noir was in a lot of ways sort of a dying genre. This both Chinatown and this fall into sort of what's considered to be neo-noir, which I think is even less well defined than noir. It's more of noir tends to fit in and around a certain era of time. And while Chinatown is set in the 30s, which is sort of appropriate, it's a little bit late for a noir setting. Maybe this one is set in the post-war era, like a decade or so later, and both of these would strictly fit into what would be considered a reasonably noir era, but they also take a different aesthetic that doesn't adhere to a lot of the visuals that typically are notable or the keys that are pointed out in noir. And it also stays away from or just lacks a lot of sort of the pulpier plot beats that I think came out of the idea of genre fiction and the pulps and these mystery novels that came out in this particular era. This is a discussion I've had before. I'm not going to rehash it right now, and I didn't go into that deep, but the history of genre fiction and pulp fiction is a whole discussion all its own that you should, if you're interested in this stuff, I would recommend doing some cursory research on, at least. 1990 is a weird time to be coming out with a noir or neo-noir or mystery in general. 90s is very much an era of even post-sci-fi, where 1974, when Chinatown came out, would have been an era when sci-fi movies and things were on the rise. The sci-fi fiction, science fiction as a literary genre was on the rise, and the rise was also being paralleled in cinema as well. And there's a lot that can be said for the parallels between various pulp genres and how aspects of noir and horror and these other things that were typically relegated to lesser fiction, lesser being big air quotes, but in literary circles at the time, there are a lot of parallels in terms of the writing styles and the thematic elements and the real world things that are being taken on by in subject matter. So a lot of noir, which was sort of grounded in this particular era, particular attitude, particular aspect of Americana were with time sort of, to my mind, supplanted by science fiction, being a both more broad and more focused way of addressing a lot of similar topics in what's clearly a very different genre. But there are quite a few pieces of fiction, I think, that would be qualified as sci-fi, but could also be very clearly pointed out as noir. I think the most obvious one there is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or also known as Blade Runner. It was adapted into Blade Runner, which I've also talked about before, and my love for that, where that is very much both a noir mystery and a sci-fi, an all-time sci-fi great. So 1974 was a weird time to make noir, and 1990 was even weirder. Like I said, it would have been a time when other genres were on the rise, and mystery was kind of on the outs. The last holdouts of that, I think, in a lot of ways, were things like James Bond, which in the 90s itself would also get a turn much more towards action. The 80s and 90s were the heyday of action films, especially coming out of the Cold War, and a lot of the historical discussions about espionage, mystery, these sorts of things were being wrapped up with the end of the Cold War. That's a whole other topic unto itself. Don't paint me reductionist for that, please. So hearkening to have this come out in 1990, and to hearken back to the post-war era, when this is already the, to turn a phrase, the post-war era, where it's after the boom of the 50s, it's after the hippie movements of the 70s, it's after the end of the Cold War in the late 80s, early 90s. This is a genre that's sort of a niche within a niche that's dead within dead. And between its interesting timing and alleged production problems, apparently it bombed in the box office. I kind of get that, and I kind of don't, because even for the time, a lot of the names on this movie were big names, and many of them would become even bigger throughout the 90s, but they were at the time big names. People like Jack Nicholson, who of course is reprising his role, and then folks like Harvey Keitel, who was sort of in growth, and a couple of other folks who were sort of in there as well. This is not a particularly worse film by any means than Chinatown. Chinatown is an extraordinarily good movie to my memory of my watching it. I'll have to go rewatch my old videos. That's why I make these, because I can't remember my own feelings. But it's a pretty extraordinary movie in a lot of ways, and sets a lot of standards for both the culmination of one era and the beginning of another in terms of cinematic abilities. It's also got a different director. Obviously, we talked last time, I think, about Polanski, and by the 90s, he was, already not being looked upon well. So this has a different director. Apparently, it went through development hell in terms of its writing and rewriting and reproduction and recasting, to the point that like Harrison Ford was going to be cast in Nicholson's role at one point. There's all kinds of shenanigans. Apparently, I just skimmed the wiki. You can do as well if you're interested in that particular stuff. But I think that generally speaking, this actually is a very good sequel in a lot of ways. It is not as visually striking at some times. It does not make as good use of some of those noir visual elements. It is less impressive cinematically. It is less impressive writing wise, a little bit, rough around the edges here and there. and the overall production is less good, but it's still quite a good film, I think. A lot of the performances are very good. A lot of the sets and costumes and other production things are very good. It does have a few more noticeable elements that are anachronistic, and in a way, the most anachronistic thing about it is because it's shot like a 90s film. And I don't know how to describe this unless I was going to spend a whole lot of time really picking into the niceties of cinematography and how it changed over various eras. This film is the post-production elements and the shooting styles are still reminiscent of Chinatown, but they are more modern in their feel. It sometimes feels like it's not taking enough from the era. It's not taking enough from cinema noir specifically to properly, it needs to appropriate more of those elements, I think, in order to be seen as having those. It's hard to define. There are very noir cinematic elements that are just a little bit too thin on the ground for this production. That said, a lot of really good performances. Nicholson, I think, reprises his role very well. A lot of other folks come back and reprise their roles in small ways, and others who are brand new but put on, I think, great performances, especially for the genre, who are appropriately whether it's femme fatale, these trope characters. There's a lot of tropes in the writing that point towards mystery and noir, and a lot of the character performances portray those really well. But there's other things in the production that make me less appreciative of what it's trying to do. That said, I think, I don't know, it's sort of a mixed bag. Like, it's been hard as I've been listening or as I've been coming back from watching it, thinking about it over the last couple of hours, because the more I think about it, the less good I feel about it as a whole. But there are a lot of individual parts of it that I think are very good, individual scenes that I think are great, even out of context, and maybe in fact better out of context than they are in the full context. Because if there was, if the plot of Chinatown sort of meanders around from time to time, and it's usually done quite well, to the point that even if you feel like you're a little bit confused or a little bit on the back foot, or not entirely sure where it's going with, even if you know what it's doing, not sure where it's planning to go with it, it culminates in ways that are very satisfying. And I think that is less true of this film. That said, I think the first 20 minutes in particular, maybe it's just because I had my expectations not set at that point, but the first 20 minutes are some of the strongest stuff in terms of setting up a story and showing off exactly how, in a cinema setting, you should present a mystery story without over explaining, with showing instead of telling, with letting us learn the characters on the fly, and letting everybody sort of play their parts as needed, which again is something that I think that Chinatown did very well as well. The problems, so I'm going to do my best to spoil this as little as possible, but this may be the most minor of spoilers. This movie does harken back very directly to Chinatown, to the point that I don't think the movie stops working if you haven't seen Chinatown. And in fact, I think they do a pretty good job of showing as the amount that they need to keep you in the loop if you weren't already familiar with Chinatown, the Chinatown plot. But it loses some of its punchiness if you haven't seen that. And where the first 20 minutes or so work on a lot of subtlety and slow burn exploration, when it starts to introduce more and more of the like historical elements that are continuing to plague the main character because of his history, it starts to lean too hard into it. Not because it's like asking it to do the heavy plot lifting, but because it's just unsubtle in its delivery. If this was a series where this was like the fourth or fifth movie, then I think that would bother me less because I would be more invested in the character. But because it's only the second movie, having this like almost nostalgic harkening back to his earlier career doesn't really work when we've only seen him for 2-ish hours before this, at least for me. So they either needed to have more movies in between or be less heavy-handed with how much they were going to recall back to that. That said, it's losing a lot on subtlety, but it's not actually problematic for the telling of the story. The story overall, I think, is told pretty well, still has compelling characters, if perhaps at times a little bit less compelling individually than some of the notable ones in Chinatown. Overall, it's still, I think, a pretty darn good movie. I'm not going to go so far as to say it's less than the sum of its parts, but it is not as much more than the sum of its parts as I wanted it to be. I think that's sort of the ultimate conclusion, is that it's not as polished, it's not as satisfying. There's a few too many little things that are just not quite right, that it's not going to be as memorable as Chinatown. It's already somewhat fleeting in some of its details, because they're there to push the story along, and they're done well enough, but they're not done extraordinarily. So do I know why this one bombed? Not really. I think it's a pretty good film overall. So maybe the answer is that just the appetite from the audience just wasn't there at the time that it released. The Wikipedia article for it and the IMDb for it are surprisingly sparse. And this is still the kind of thing that I'd like to see more stories from. I'd like to see more mysteries in general. I'd like to see more neo-noir stuff, or interpretations of mystery and noir things that, again, I've talked about time and time again at this point with dozens of movies at this point in this series. These are dying or dead genres, or dormant at least. I don't want to call them dead, that I'd like to see re-reviewed. But again, when it comes to some of the elements in terms of establishing especially a detective character of some kind that we are compelled by and want to follow, the only contender in quite a long time has been, as we mentioned some in two previous videos, and I think maybe in one or two others, is Benoit Blanc from the Knives Out series, a name that I still am bothered by. I need more of this. I need more. It can be modern like Benoit Blanc. It can be, again, a hearkening back to these previous eras. I would love to see noir revival. I think it still works. I would love to see, even going forward, those sci-fi elements come in. I think there's tons to be explored in this area. And I could see how this being sort of a notable film probably at the time, this could also have done more to kill the genre when it underperformed. We could get into the problems with box office financing then and now, but that's, again, a different video. I still think this is a pretty good film, and I think if you've seen Chinatown and like it, and you like the character, and it's an interesting thing to continue to see, I think this follows in its footsteps very well and doesn't leave too much for me to complain about. So I would say it's definitely worth the watch. Um, Aside from some, mostly minor things, it's pretty enjoyable. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.